At 2 a.m., the rules change. Every creak, every shadow, takes on new meaning when you're the only one in a building filled with forgotten memories. This isn't just a night shift. It's a descent into the unknown, where the past isn't just collected, it's alive. Are you ready to uncover the secrets lurking in the dusty archives? My name is Elena Rodriguez, and 6 months ago, I thought I'd landed the perfect job. Night security at the Copper Valley Historical Society in Tombstone, Arizona seemed like easy money. Sit in a quiet building, do a few rounds, maybe catch up on some reading between patrols. The pay was surprisingly good for such simple work, which should have been my first warning sign. Nothing good ever comes easy, especially in a town where Boot Hill Cemetery holds more residents than the living population. The Copper Valley Historical Society sits on the edge of town like a monument to forgotten time. Built in 1889 from native sandstone, the building originally served as the territorial courthouse before transforming into a repository for the region's complex history. During the day, it's filled with tourists eager to glimpse authentic artifacts from the Old West, mining equipment that once pulled silver from the earth, photographs of long-dead pioneers whose eyes seem to follow you across the room, and personal belongings that tell stories of triumph and tragedy in equal measure. But at night, when the last tour group departs and the heavy oak doors swing shut with a finality that echoes through empty halls, the building transforms into something else entirely, something that requires rules. I discovered this during my first week, when Mrs. Catherine Aldridge, the Society's elderly director, handed me a folded piece of yellow paper along with my keys and security badge. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she pressed it into my palm, and her usually warm brown eyes carried a weight I couldn't understand then. "Read this carefully, dear," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every word matters after midnight." At first glance, the paper appeared to contain standard security protocols. Lock all doors, check windows, maintain patrol logs. But as I studied it more closely under the harsh fluorescent light of the break room, I noticed additional instructions written in different handwriting, as if multiple people had contributed to this document over time. The ink colors varied from deep black to faded blue, suggesting these rules have been added across many years, maybe decades. The additional rules seemed strange, almost superstitious. Things like never acknowledge sounds from the pioneer room after 1 a.m., and if the temperature drops suddenly in the mining exhibit, leave immediately and wait in the main lobby. I remember laughing nervously, assuming this was some kind of hazing ritual for new employees. Small towns are known for their quirky traditions, and Tombstone certainly had its share of ghost stories to entertain the tourists. That first night, I arrived at 11 p.m. with a thermos of coffee and a paperback novel, expecting nothing more eventful than the occasional car passing on the street outside. The building felt different in darkness, larger somehow, with corners that seemed to stretch deeper than they should and shadows that moved independently of any light source. But I attributed these sensations to new job jitters and the natural eeriness of being alone in an old building. The security office occupied a small space near the main entrance, equipped with outdated monitors showing feed from cameras positioned throughout the building. Most of the screens flickered occasionally, casting dancing shadows on the walls that made me jump more than once during those first few hours. A logbook sat open on the desk, filled with entries from previous guards dating back several years. Reading through them, I noticed a pattern: short, cryptic notes that said more about what didn't happen than what did. Quiet night. Followed all protocols. Minor temperature fluctuation in mining exhibit at 2:15 a.m. Waited in lobby as instructed. Heard singing from the children's display. Did not investigate. These entries should have concerned me more than they did. But exhaustion was setting in, and I found myself dismissing them as inside jokes or attempts to spook the new guy. Small town humor, nothing more. I made my first patrol at midnight. walking through exhibits filled with mannequins dressed in period clothing, their glass eyes reflecting my flashlight beam in ways that made my skin crawl. Everything seemed normal, if you could call normal being surrounded by reminders of people who'd been dead for over a century. The Pioneer Room housed the society's most prized possessions, personal items donated by descendants of Tombstone's original families. Wedding dresses yellowed with age hung in glass, cases next to children's toys and family photographs. A rocking chair that supposedly belonged to the wife of a famous lawman sat roped off in one corner, and more than once I could have sworn I saw it moving slightly, as if responding to an invisible occupant. The mining exhibit told the story of Tombstone's silver boom through artifacts recovered from the mines themselves: pickaxes, lanterns, and chunks of ore that still glittered in the display lighting. The centerpiece was a recreation of a mine shaft entrance, complete with wooden support beams and realistic sound effects that played during operating hours. At night, with the sounds disabled, the mock tunnel entrance seemed to exhale a cold breath that carried scents of earth and something else I couldn't identify. But it was the children's display that bothered me most during that first patrol. Antique toys, small clothes, and photographs of long-dead children filled several cases, creating a memorial to young lives cut short by the harsh realities of frontier existence. The centerpiece was a collection of handmade dolls, their porcelain faces cracked with age, but still retaining an unsettling lifelike quality. Their painted eyes seemed to track my movement as I passed, and I found myself hurrying through this section more quickly than the others. By 2 a.m., I'd settled back into the security office, convinced that my co-workers had been trying to scare me with their mysterious rules and cryptic logbook entries. The building was old, certainly, and old buildings make noise. They settle and creak, and sometimes play tricks on your imagination, especially when you're tired and surrounded by reminders of mortality. I was prepared to write off the entire experience as overactive imagination combined with too much caffeine. That's when I heard the first whisper. It came from somewhere deep in the building, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human in origin. My first instinct was to investigate. After all, I was security, and investigating unusual sound was literally my job. I stood up, flashlight in hand, ready to check for intruders or maybe a radio left on somewhere. But something made me pause and glance at that folded paper Mrs. Aldridge had given me. Rule number 7, written in faded blue ink. Listen closely, but never respond. Never investigate whispers after 2 a.m. The whisper came again, slightly louder this time, seeming to drift from the direction of the Pioneer Room. It sounded almost conversational, like someone tried to get my attention. Every instinct screamed at me to investigate, to ensure the building's security. But something in Mrs. Aldridge's expression when she'd handed me those rules, the weight in her eyes, made me hesitate. I sat back down, hands trembling slightly as I gripped my coffee cup. The whispers continued for nearly an hour, sometimes seeming to come from different parts of the building, sometimes so close they might have been right outside the office door. But I didn't investigate. I didn't respond. I simply sat and listened, my heart hammering against my ribs as I began to understand that this job was going to be far more complicated than I'd anticipated. When my shift ended at 7 a.m. and daylight began streaming through the windows, the building felt normal again. The whispers had stopped around 5 a.m., and the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over everything like a heavy blanket simply evaporated with the sunrise. I filled out my logbook entry, keeping it brief and cryptic like the others. Quiet night. Followed all protocols. Mrs. Aldridge arrived as I was preparing to leave, and she studied my face carefully before asking, "How was your first night, dear?" "Interesting," I replied, handing her the keys. "Those rules you gave me, are they really necessary?" Her expression softened with what might have been relief. "You follow them?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you'll do just fine here, Elena. Some buildings have history. This one has memory." And memory, well, memory doesn't always rest easy. As I drove home through the empty streets of Tombstone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd passed some kind of test. The job paid well because it demanded more than sitting in a chair and making occasional patrols. It required respect for rules that didn't make logical sense, but had been written in blood, sweat, and fear by people who'd learned the hard way that some things are better left undisturbed. That afternoon, as I tried to sleep in my small apartment, I found myself thinking about those whispers and wondering what might have happened if I'd chosen to investigate. Part of me was curious, but a larger part was grateful for Mrs. Aldridge's warnings. Whatever secrets the Copper Valley Historical Society held, I was beginning to understand that ignorance might truly be bliss. But curiosity, as they say, killed the cat. And despite my better judgment, I knew I'd be counting the hours until my next shift, eager to learn more about the rules that govern the night and the memories that refuse to stay buried in the past. The second week brought clarity about why my predecessors had developed such specific protocols for overnight security. What I'd initially dismissed as superstition revealed itself as hard-earned wisdom, written in the margins of terror by guards who'd learned to navigate the building's nocturnal personality through trial and error. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were survival mechanisms. Rule number 1 became my lifeline. Never look back when walking alone through the exhibits after midnight. This wasn't about paranoia. It was about maintaining sanity in a place where the past had a habit of following you. I learned this lesson during my 8th night, while making my routine 1 a.m. patrol through the Pioneer Room. The sensation started as a gentle prickling at the base of my neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. As I moved between display cases, examining artifacts under the beam of my flashlight, the feeling intensified. Footsteps echoed mine with perfect precision, not quite matching my pace, but following close enough to be unmistakable. At first, I assumed it was simply my own steps creating an echo in the high-ceilinged room. But when I stopped to examine a particularly interesting photograph of Tombstone's Main Street circa 1882, the footsteps continued for 3 more beats before falling silent. Every fiber of my being wanted to turn around to confirm what logic told me couldn't be there. But Rule 1 held me in place like a physical restraint. Instead, I continued my patrol with measured steps, fighting the urge to break into a run as those phantom footsteps matched my pace through the remaining exhibits. The sensation of being followed persisted until I reached the security office, where it vanished abruptly, as if whatever had been trailing me couldn't cross the threshold. Rule number 2 proved equally essential. Listen closely, but never respond to voices, whispers, or calls for help after midnight. The building's acoustic properties seemed to shift dramatically once the sun set, carrying sounds from impossible distances and directions. Conversations drifted from empty rooms, sometimes in English, sometimes in Spanish, and occasionally in languages I couldn't identify, but which sounded distinctly Native American. The most unnerving occurred during my 3rd week, around 2:30 a.m. I was reviewing inventory logs when a woman's voice called out clearly from the direction of the children's display. "Elena? Elena, can you help me find my daughter?" The voice carried such genuine distress that I was halfway out of my chair before Rule 2 reasserted itself. I forced myself to sit back down, hands gripping the desk edge as the voice continued calling my name, growing more desperate with each repetition. The woman claimed her little girl had wandered off during a tour and might be hiding among the exhibits. She pleaded for help checking the Pioneer Room, insisting she could hear her daughter crying. 4:47 minutes. I checked the clock obsessively. That voice called for assistance, growing increasingly frantic. It knew my name, knew details about the building's layout that suggested intimate familiarity, and carried emotional authenticity that made ignoring it feel like a betrayal of basic human decency. But I'd learned to trust the rules over my instincts, and when the voice finally faded around 3:17 a.m., I understood why the previous guards had emphasized never responding to auditory phenomena. The morning brought a disturbing discovery. Mrs. Aldridge arrived to find me pale and shaken, and after I described the night's events, she retrieved a thick folder from her office files. Inside were newspaper clippings dating back to 1952, when the building still served as a courthouse. A woman named Isabella Morales had lost her 6-year-old daughter, Carmen, during a custody hearing. The child had wandered away from the courtroom and was found 3 days later in an abandoned mine shaft outside town, having fallen through a concealed opening. Isabella had returned to the courthouse every day for months, convinced her daughter's spirit was trapped there, calling for help. She was eventually institutionalized after being found in the building at night, talking to empty rooms and claiming she could hear Carmen crying. The newspaper photo showed a woman whose voice, I realized with growing horror, had matched exactly what I'd heard calling my name. Rule 3 presented perhaps the greatest challenge. Never touch, move, or interact with artifacts that appear out of place or in different positions than documented. This rule required constant vigilance because items in the Copper Valley Historical Society had a disturbing tendency to migrate during nighttime hours. The first incident involved a child's rocking horse from a children's display. According to the inventory chart, it belonged in case 7, positioned facing west toward the main window. During my 4th week, I discovered it had somehow moved to case 3, now facing the interior of the room as if watching the entrance. The brass nameplate still read, "Donated by the Morrison family in memory of Timothy Morrison, age 4, died 1887. My initial impulse was to return it to its proper position. After all, maintaining the exhibit's integrity was part of my job description. But Rule 3 held me back, and I simply documented the change in my logbook. Rocking horse relocated. Did not adjust per protocol. The next morning, Mrs. Aldridge found the horse back in its original position, facing west as if it had never moved at all. But the security camera footage showed something that shouldn't have been possible. At 3:33 a.m., the horse had simply vanished from case 3 and reappeared in case 7, with no visible means of transportation. The Morrison boy died of scarlet fever, Mrs. Aldridge explained when I asked about the family. Timothy was playing in this very building when it was still a courthouse. His father was testifying in a mining dispute, and the boy took sick suddenly. He died in what's now the break room, calling for his rocking horse. The family donated it to the Historical Society when the building was converted, with specific instructions that it always face west, toward the cemetery where Timothy is buried. More disturbing were the dolls in the children's display that regularly changed positions overnight. The collection included 12 handmade dolls dating from the 1880s through the early 1900s, each carefully positioned according to the donor family's wishes. But by morning, I'd often find them arranged in small circles, as if they'd been having conversations. Sometimes they all faced the same direction, looking toward the door as if expecting someone to arrive. Once, I discovered them arranged around a 13th doll that didn't appear in any inventory records. A crude, handmade figure with button eyes and hair made from what looked like real human strands. That particular morning, Mrs. Aldridge went pale when she saw my logbook entry about the extra doll. She made a phone call that I wasn't supposed to overhear, speaking in rapid Spanish to someone who sounded equally distressed. The 13th doll disappeared that day, and I never saw it again. But sometimes I caught glimpses of small figures moving in my peripheral vision, as if the original 12 were searching for their missing companion. The mining exhibit presented its own challenges. Tools would migrate between displays, and the chunks of ore would sometimes be found arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random movement. Most unsettling was the mock mine shaft entrance, which occasionally exhaled sounds that had nothing to do with the building's ventilation system. Deep groans echoed from within the fake tunnel, sometimes accompanied by the distant sound of pickaxes striking stone and voices calling out in distress. During my 6th week, I discovered a mining helmet sitting outside the mock shaft entrance, positioned as if someone had just removed it after completing a shift. The helmet wasn't part of the display. It was modern equipment, probably dating from the 1960s based on its design. Attached to it was a handwritten note. "They're still down there, waiting for the shift change." Rule 3 prevented me from examining the helmet more closely or moving it back to wherever it belonged. I simply documented its presence and continued my patrol, though I couldn't shake the image of that hastily scrawled message. The next morning, the helmet was gone, but a thin layer of coal dust covered the floor around where it had been sitting. Mrs. Aldridge's reaction to my report confirmed that this wasn't an isolated incident. "We get items sometimes that don't belong to our collection," she explained carefully. "Objects that find their way here on their own, usually connected to tragic events in the mines. We've learned it's better not to interfere with their presence. They disappear when they're ready." These experiences taught me to trust the rules implicitly, even when they contradicted every instinct screaming at me to investigate or intervene. The building operated according to its own logic, and the protocols developed by my predecessors weren't suggestions. They were the difference between maintaining sanity and joining the voices that called out in the darkness. But understanding the rules was only the beginning. Each night brought new challenges that tested my ability to follow protocols while surrounded by evidence that the past wasn't content to remain buried. The whispers grew more personal, the footsteps more insistent, and the moving artifacts more bold in their midnight migrations. By the end of my first month, I'd begun to understand that the Copper Valley Historical Society wasn't just a repository for objects from Tombstone's history. It was a nexus where unresolved trauma manifested in ways that defied rational explanation. The rules weren't about supernatural etiquette. They were about respecting the pain that lingered in a place where so many stories had ended badly. And I was beginning to suspect that the most important rule hadn't been written down yet. The one about what happened to guards who stayed too long and began to blur the line between observer and participant in the building's nightly dramas. The Pioneer Room held secrets that went deeper than mere historical artifacts. By my 6th week, I'd begun to recognize patterns in the building's nocturnal behavior, and nowhere were these patterns more pronounced than in the room dedicated to Tombstone's earliest families. The mannequins dressed in period clothing weren't just display pieces. They were focal points for memories that refused to fade. The centerpiece of the collection was Martha Caldwell's wedding dress, displayed in a climate-controlled case alongside her diary and a daguerreotype of her wedding day in 1881. Martha had married Dr. Benjamin Caldwell, one of Tombstone's first physicians, in a ceremony held in the same building when it still served as a courthouse. But their happiness had been short-lived. 6 months after the wedding, Benjamin was killed in a mining accident, and Martha, pregnant with their first child, died in childbirth 3 months later. What made Martha's story particularly haunting was how her presence manifested in the Pioneer Room. The temperature around her display case dropped 15 degrees every night at exactly 11:47 p.m., the recorded time of her death, according to the church records. But more disturbing were the handprints that appeared on the glass, always from the inside, as if someone trapped within the case was trying to get out. During my 7th week, I witnessed something that forced me to confront the reality of what I was dealing with. I was conducting my midnight patrol when the display lighting in Martha's case began to flicker erratically. As I approached to investigate, the case suddenly filled with a thick, gray mist that shouldn't have been possible given the sealed environment. Through the fog, I could see the wedding dress beginning to move, the fabric rustling as if invisible hands were adjusting the folds. Then I heard her voice, soft, desperate, speaking with the educated accent of a woman from a well-to-do Eastern family. "Benjamin? Benjamin, where are you? The baby is coming, and I'm so frightened." The voice was coming from inside the case, and the wedding dress was now moving as if worn by an invisible bride. The diary pages fluttered despite the absence of any air current, and the daguerreotype seemed to shimmer, the faces in the photograph becoming more animated, more real. Every instinct screamed at me to help, to respond, to somehow comfort this woman who died in terror over 140 years ago. But Rule 2 held me in place, and I forced myself to continue my patrol while Martha Caldwell's pleas for her deceased husband echoed through the room. The phenomena lasted until 12:33 a.m., exactly the amount of time between her husband's death and her own, as if she was reliving those final, desperate weeks every single night. The morning brought a disturbing conversation with Mrs. Aldridge, who studied my pale face with knowing concern. "You met Martha last night," she said. "It wasn't a question. How do you know?" "Because she appears when the building senses someone who might understand her pain." Martha was educated, intelligent, trapped in circumstances beyond her control. She recognizes kindred spirits. Mrs. Aldridge pulled a thick file from her desk drawer. "We've had 43 security guards over the past 20 years. Martha only appears for certain ones. Usually women. Usually those who face their own losses." I hadn't mentioned anything about loss to Mrs. Aldridge, but something in her expression suggested she knew about the miscarriage I'd suffered 2 years earlier, the reason I'd moved to Tombstone in the first place. Small towns have ways of sharing information, and grief leaves marks that observant people can recognize. The file contained reports from other guards who'd encountered Martha, each describing similar phenomena: the temperature drop, the moving dress, the desperate calls for her husband. But most disturbing were the notes about guards who tried to respond to her pleas. 3 had quit immediately after attempting to communicate with her. 2 had been found in the morning, sitting in the Pioneer Room, speaking to empty air. 1 had required hospitalization after insisting that Martha was real, that she needed help, that the building was trapping innocent souls. "The ones who try to help her don't last long," Mrs. Aldridge explained. "Martha's pain is infectious. She draws people into her tragedy, makes them want to join her in that endless loop of waiting for Benjamin to return." But Martha wasn't the only presence in the Pioneer Room. The rocking chair that belonged to Eleanor Washington, the wife of a Buffalo soldier stationed in Tombstone, would creak rhythmically from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. The hours Eleanor had spent waiting for her husband to return from patrol during the Apache conflicts of the 1880s. The chair would rock empty, but sometimes I could see the faint impression of a small woman in calico, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the window, as if watching for riders on the horizon. Eleanor's husband, Sergeant James Washington, never did come home from that final patrol. His unit was ambushed 15 miles outside town, and Eleanor spent the rest of her life in that chair, waiting for news that would never come. She died there in 1923, still rocking, still waiting, and apparently had never stopped. The most chilling encounter occurred during my 8th week, when I discovered that the Historical Society's collection included items that hadn't been formally donated. Hidden in a storage room behind the Pioneer Room were boxes of personal belongings that had simply appeared over the years. Things that belonged to people whose stories had been forgotten or deliberately obscured. One box contained the belongings of a Chinese immigrant named Wei Chun, who died in a mining accident in 1885. Despite Tombstone's significant Chinese population during the boom years, very few of their stories were included in the official historical record. Wei's possessions had appeared in the building the night after a construction crew accidentally disturbed what had likely been an unmarked grave during renovation work in the 1970s. Among Wei's belongings was a journal written in Chinese characters, along with photographs of family members who'd remained in China and letters that would never be delivered. On nights when I ventured too close to that storage room, I could hear the soft sound of someone writing with a fountain pen, accompanied by quiet sobs and occasional words in Mandarin that sounded like prayers or pleas for forgiveness. Mrs. Aldridge explained that Way's presence was different from the others, more focused on completing unfinished business rather than reliving trauma. He wants his story told, wants his family remembered. But the Historical Society Board has never been comfortable including immigrant experiences in our official exhibits. The discovery of these hidden collections revealed the building's true nature. It wasn't just preserving the sanitized history presented to tourists, but serving as a sanctuary for all the stories that had been overlooked or deliberately forgotten. The Chinese laborers, the Mexican families displaced by mining operations, the Apache whose land had been taken, the women whose achievements have been attributed to their husbands. All of them have found ways to make their presence known in the building dedicated to preserving the past. During my 9th week, I began to understand that the voices I heard weren't random supernatural phenomena, but desperate attempts at communication from people whose stories have been erased from official records. The whispers that called my name weren't trying to lure me into danger. They were asking for acknowledgement, for someone to bear witness to their existence. The most heartbreaking discovery came when I found a child's belongings in the deepest part of the storage area. Tiny shoes, a handmade doll, and a slate tablet with the alphabet carefully practiced in chalk. These items belonged to Maria Santos, a 6-year-old girl who died during a tuberculosis outbreak in 1889. Her family had been migrant workers, following mining operations throughout Arizona, and when Maria died, there hadn't been money for a proper burial or memorial. Maria's presence was the gentlest of all the spirits in the building. She didn't call out or move objects dramatically. Instead, she left small signs of her existence. Chalk handprints on windows, the faint sound of a child humming lullabies, and sometimes, if I was very still and very quiet during my patrols, I could see a small figure in a white dress playing with toys that weren't part of any official collection. Unlike the adult spirits who seemed trapped in cycles of trauma and regret, Maria's presence felt more like curiosity than desperation. She was simply a child who'd found a place where she could continue to exist, surrounded by the stories and memories of a town that had briefly been her home. These discoveries forced me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about the Copper Valley Historical Society. It wasn't just a museum. It was a memorial to all the lives that had been touched by Tombstone's violent and complicated history. The rules weren't about avoiding ghosts, but about respecting the pain and trauma that had crystallized in a place where so many stories had ended badly. But understanding the building's true nature raised new questions about my role as its guardian. Was I simply a security guard, or had I become something more? A witness to stories that might otherwise be lost forever, a keeper of memories that official history had chosen to forget? The answer would come sooner than I expected, and it would test everything I thought I understood about the rules that govern the night shift at the Copper Valley Historical Society. Time moves differently in places where tragedy has crystallized into something tangible. By my 10th week at the Copper Valley Historical Society, I learned that the building didn't just house historical artifacts. It existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously, with the past bleeding through into the present like watercolors in the rain. The phenomenon started subtly. Clocks throughout the building would show different times, despite being synchronized during the day. The antique grandfather clock in the main hall consistently ran 13 minutes slow, while modern digital displays in the security office would sometimes skip ahead by hours or crawl backward, digit by digit, as if time itself was uncertain about its direction. During my 11th week, I experienced my first complete temporal displacement. I was conducting my 2 a.m. patrol through the mining exhibit when the familiar sound of my footsteps on hardwood floors was gradually replaced by the crunch of gravel and sand. The display lighting flickered and dimmed, replaced by the warm, yellow glow of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls that had somehow transformed from painted plaster to rough-hewn timber. The modern exhibit cases had vanished, replaced by actual mining equipment still dusty from use. Pickaxes leaned against wooden support beams that bore fresh tool marks. and the air carried scents of earth, sweat, and blasting powder that were impossible in the climate-controlled environment I knew I should be occupying. Most disturbing of all, I could hear voices, not the ethereal whispers I'd grown accustomed to, but the clear, immediate conversation of men finishing their shift in a working mine. "Rodriguez, you coming up? Were you planning to stay down here all night?" The voice came from the mock mine shaft entrance, which now appeared to extend deep into actual darkness rather than ending in a painted backdrop 3 feet from the opening. It took me several disorienting seconds to realize the voice was addressing me, using my surname in a way that suggested familiarity. My reflection in a piece of polished metal showed not my security guard uniform, but rough work clothes and a mining helmet with a carbide lamp attached. My hands, when I looked at them, were calloused and stained with or dust. Every rational thought screamed that this was impossible, but the experience felt completely authentic. I could taste the metallic tang of underground air and feel the weight of the helmet on my head. When I touched the nearest wooden support beam, splinters caught in my fingers, and the sensation was absolutely real. "Elena, come on. Your shift ended 20 minutes ago." Another voice, closer now, accompanied by the sound of boots on stone. A figure emerged from the tunnel entrance. A man in his 30s with kind eyes and a thick mustache, carrying a lunch pail and wearing the same rough work clothes I somehow now wore. He looked at me with genuine concern, the way a friend looks at someone who's acting strangely. "You feeling all right? You've been standing there like you're seeing ghosts." The comment snapped me back to awareness of where, or when, I actually was. This man was clearly from another era, possibly the 1880s based on his clothing and speech patterns. But he saw me as belonging to his time, as someone who worked alongside him in these mines. The temporal displacement wasn't just affecting my perception. It was inserting me into the building's historical memory as an active participant. Fighting every instinct that wanted to respond to his friendly concern, I forced myself to remember Rule 2, never respond to voices. I closed my eyes tightly and concentrated on the reality I knew to be true. I was Elena Rodriguez, a night security guard in 2024, standing in a climate-controlled museum exhibit. When I opened my eyes, the oil lamps had been replaced by familiar fluorescent lighting, and the mining equipment was safely behind glass again. But the taste of underground air lingered in my mouth, and my fingers were still stained with or dust that shouldn't have existed. These temporal episodes became increasingly frequent and intense. During my 12th week, I found myself briefly inhabiting the courthouse era, standing in what was now the Pioneer Room, but had been a courtroom where Martha Caldwell had been married. I watched her wedding ceremony as if I were a guest, seeing the joy on her face that would be so tragically short-lived. She looked directly at me during the proceedings, nodding slightly as if recognizing a familiar face among the witnesses. Most disturbing was realizing that these weren't random historical glimpses, but specific moments of significance. Times when strong emotions had burned themselves into the building's memory so deeply that they continued to replay like psychic recordings. And somehow, the building was casting me as participant in these memories rather than just an observer. The episodes weren't limited to happy occasions. I experienced Martha's death and childbirth, feeling her terror and pain as if they were my own. I witnessed Wei Chin's final moments after the mining accident, understanding his desperate desire to send one last message to his family in China. Most heartbreaking was sharing little Maria Santos's confusion as tuberculosis took her life, her child's mind unable to comprehend why she felt so tired and why her mother cried constantly. These experiences left me emotionally drained and psychologically fragmented. I began to have difficulty distinguishing between my own memories and the historical events I'd witnessed. Sometimes I would catch myself humming lullabies in Spanish that Maria had loved, or speaking phrases in Mandarin that Way had written in his journal. Mrs. Aldridge noticed the changes immediately. "You're spending too much time with them," she said during one of our morning handover conversations. "The building is pulling you deeper into its memories." Previous guards who've experienced this level of temporal displacement, they don't last long in the present. She showed me files on guards who'd become too embedded in the building's historical memory. Some had quit abruptly, claiming they belonged to different time periods and couldn't adapt to modern life. Others have been found during their shifts, speaking to empty rooms as if continuing conversations with long-dead residents. Most disturbing were the 3 guards who had simply vanished during their shifts, leaving no trace except logbook entries that grew increasingly disconnected from reality. David Morrison lasted 6 months, Mrs. Aldridge explained, showing me a photograph of a cheerful young man who'd worked a night shift in 2019. His final entries describe detailed conversations with miners from the 1880s. He wrote about learning mining techniques and planning to invest in silver claims that had been exhausted for over a century. Security cameras showed him talking animatedly to empty rooms, sometimes for hours at a time. He was found one morning in the mining exhibit, unconscious and suffering from what doctors described as severe dehydration and exhaustion, as if he'd been doing physical labor all night. David had recovered physically, but never psychologically. He insisted that his real life was in 1884, working alongside men whose names appeared on historical mining crew rosters. When he was released from psychiatric care, he'd moved to an abandoned mining town in Nevada, convinced that his friends from the 1880s were waiting for him there. "The building doesn't just preserve history," Mrs. Aldridge continued. "It preserves the emotional states of people who died with unfinished business. When you're exposed to that much concentrated trauma and longing, it starts to feel more real than your actual life. The past begins to seem like home." Her warning came just in time. During my 13th week, I experienced the most intense temporal displacement yet. I was conducting my midnight patrol when the entire building shifted around me, walls dissolving and reforming to show the courthouse as it had appeared during its final days in 1929. I found myself wearing a 1920s dress, complete with period-appropriate shoes that pinched my feet and hairstyled in finger waves that felt foreign yet familiar. I was standing in what had been the main courtroom, now filled with families whose children had died during the influenza pandemic that had swept through Tombstone in the winter of 1928 to 1929. The proceedings weren't a trial, but a community meeting, where parents were sharing memories of their lost children and discussing the creation of a memorial. The emotional weight in the room was crushing. Parents clutched photographs of children whose ages ranged from infancy to adolescence, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed look of grief that has no cure. I could feel their pain as if it were my own. And when a woman approached me, a woman who looked remarkably like an older version of Maria Santos, I nearly responded to her question about whether I'd lost a child as well. But something in her eyes stopped me. There was a depth of sorrow there that belonged to someone who had genuinely lost a daughter, not to me, who was experiencing borrowed grief. The recognition snapped me back to awareness of my true situation, and I realized I was on the verge of completely losing myself in the building's historical memory. I forced myself to recite facts about my real life, my name, the current year, my reasons for taking this job. Slowly, the 1920s courtroom faded, replaced by familiar exhibit cases and modern lighting. But the emotional residue lingered, and I found myself crying for children I'd never known and parents whose grief I'd experienced as if it were my own. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable. I began to dread entering certain areas of the building, knowing that each room held memories that might pull me deeper into the past. Sleep became elusive as dreams filled with historical figures who treated me as an old friend, begging me to stay in their time period where I clearly belonged. During my 14th week, I made a decision that violated everything I'd learned about the building's rules. When Martha Caldwell's nightly manifestation began in the Pioneer Room, instead of continuing my patrol, I approached her display case and spoke directly to the desperate voice calling for her husband. "Martha, Benjamin isn't coming back," I said quietly. "He died in a mine 6 months ago. You're not waiting for him anymore. You're dead too, and your baby with you. It's 2024 now. You've been holding on to this pain for over 140 years. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The temperature in the room plummeted so rapidly that my breath became visible, and the display case began to vibrate as if something inside were struggling violently to escape. Martha's voice rose to a scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a sound of grief and rage that made my ears ring and my vision blur. But then, something unexpected happened. The screaming stopped, replaced by a sound I'd never heard from any of the building's spirits. Laughter. Soft, genuine laughter that carried relief instead of pain. "Thank you," Martha's voice whispered, closer than it had ever been before. I'd forgotten that it was over." The display case stopped shaking, and the temperature began to return to normal. But most remarkable was what I saw reflected in the glass. Not my own face, but Martha's, young and peaceful, free from the desperate expression that had characterized her nightly appearances. She smiled at me through the glass, raised one hand in farewell, and faded away. That morning, Mrs. Aldridge found significant changes in the Pioneer Room. Martha's wedding dress, which had moved restlessly every night for decades, hung perfectly still in its case. The diary lay open to the final entry, where Martha had written about accepting her fate and praying for peace. Most telling of all, the handprints that had appeared on the inside of the case every night had vanished, leaving the glass clear for the first time in anyone's memory. "You helped her move on," Mrs. Aldridge said, studying my face carefully. "In 23 years of working here, I've never seen one of them find peace." How did you know what to say? I wasn't sure how to explain that Martha's grief had become so intertwined with my own experiences that I'd instinctively understood what she needed to hear. The temporal displacements hadn't just shown me historical events. They created genuine connections between my consciousness and the spirits trapped in the building's memory. But Martha's departure had consequences. With one of the strongest presences gone, the building's temporal stability became even more unpredictable. Other spirits grew more active, as if Martha's release had shown them that escape was possible. The nightly phenomena intensified dramatically, and I found myself dealing with multiple temporal displacements during each shift. By my 15th week, I realized I was facing the same choice that had confronted every gar before me: lose myself completely in the building's historical memory, or find a way to break free before it was too late. But unlike my predecessors, I'd learned something crucial about the nature of the spirits haunting the Copper Valley Historical Society. They weren't trying to trap me in the past. They were asking for help finding their way to whatever comes after. And I might be the first person in decades who was capable of providing that assistance. The question was whether I could help them without losing myself in the process. The answer came during what would prove to be my final week at the Copper Valley Historical Society. After Martha's departure, the building's nocturnal personality had shifted dramatically, as if her release had disturbed a delicate balance that had existed for over a century. The remaining spirits no longer followed predictable patterns, and the temporal displacements became so frequent that I sometimes couldn't tell which era I was experiencing from moment to moment. On Tuesday night of my 16th week, I arrived for my shift to find Mrs. Aldridge waiting in the security office with an expression I'd never seen before. Not concern or caution, but something approaching fear. "Elena, I need to tell you something that should have been explained from the beginning," she said, her weathered hands trembling as she poured coffee from a thermos. "This building, it's not just a repository for historical artifacts. It's a kind of way station for souls who died with unfinished business. They're drawn here because it's a place dedicated to preserving memory, and memory is all they have left. She pulled out a thick folder I'd never seen before, filled with documents dating back to the building's conversion from courthouse to historical society in 1932. The project had been funded by a mysterious benefactor who'd insisted on specific architectural modifications. Rooms designed according to principles borrowed from spiritualism, materials chosen for their alleged ability to conduct psychic energy, and a layout that created what one document described as optimal conditions for maintaining spiritual resonance. The benefactor was Dr. Edmund Whitmore, a physician who had lost his entire family in the 1918 influenza pandemic. Mrs. Aldridge continued. He spent the rest of his life studying what he called persistent consciousness, the idea that traumatic death could leave imprints that continue to exist after biological death. This building was his attempt to create a sanctuary where those imprints could find peace. The documents revealed that Dr. Whitmore had worked with mediums and spiritualists to design the Copper Valley Historical Society as both a museum and a kind of supernatural hospice. The rules that govern night shift operations weren't arbitrary superstitions, but protocols developed through decades of trial and error, designed to help troubled spirits find resolution while protecting the living from becoming permanently entangled in their trauma. Every night security guard whose work here has been chosen for specific qualities, Mrs. Aldridge explained. Empathy, emotional resilience, and most importantly, the ability to maintain their own identity while experiencing others' memories. You're not just a security guard, Elena. You're a bridge between the world of the living and whatever comes after death. This revelation explained why the building had begun pulling me so deeply into its historical memories. The spirits weren't trying to trap me. They were trying to use my consciousness as a conduit for processing their unfinished business. But the process was dangerous, as evidenced by the guards who had lost themselves in the past or simply vanished during their shifts. What happened to the ones who disappeared? I asked. Mrs. Aldridge's expression grew even more troubled. We believe they chose to stay with the spirits they'd grown attached to. The building exists in multiple temporal states simultaneously, and it's possible to become permanently displaced into one of them. The missing guards may still be here, existing in time periods where they feel they belong. That night, I experienced the most intense supernatural activity since my first week on the job. Every spirit in the building manifested simultaneously, creating a cacophony of voices, temporal displacements, and emotional impressions that threatened to overwhelm my consciousness entirely. But instead of random chaos, I began to recognize a pattern. They were all trying to communicate the same message. Wei Chen appeared in the mining exhibit, still writing in his journal, but now looking directly at me as he worked. He gestured toward unfinished letters scattered around his workspace, documents that would never reach his family in China. Eleanor Washington materialized in her rocking chair, but instead of staring out the window, she was looking at me with eyes full of acceptance, as if she'd finally understood that her husband wasn't coming home. Little Maria Santos was the most active of all. She ran through the exhibits, gathering toys and personal items that belonged to other child spirits, children who died during various epidemics and accidents throughout Tombstone's history. She was organizing a kind of spiritual reunion, bringing together all the young souls who'd been separated by time and circumstance. As the night progressed, I realized what was happening. Martha's successful transition had shown the other spirits that resolution was possible, and they were all asking for the same help I'd given her: acknowledgement of their deaths, recognition of their stories, and permission to let go of the pain that had kept them bound to the building for so long, but helping them in experiencing their final moments as if they were my own, absorbing the full emotional weight of their unfinished business. Wei Chen's homesickness and guilt over leaving his family became indistinguishable from my own feelings. Eleanor's decades of waiting merged with my memory until I could barely remember which losses were real and which were inherited trauma. Most challenging was Maria Santos, whose child's understanding of death was so incomplete that helping her required explaining concepts she'd never been able to grasp in life. I found myself kneeling in the children's display, speaking gently to a presence I could feel but barely see, explaining that death wasn't punishment or abandonment, but simply the end of one kind of existence and the beginning of another. Your mama loved you very much, I whispered to the empty air. She couldn't come with you because her time wasn't finished yet, but you don't have to wait for her anymore. There are people on the other side who've been waiting to take care of you. The response was immediate, a sense of sudden understanding, followed by the lightest touch on my cheek, like a child's kiss goodbye. The temperature in the room warmed noticeably, and the toys that had been arranged in circles throughout the display case returned to their original positions, as if released from some invisible force that had been moving them. One by one, I helped each spirit find closure. I acknowledged Wei Chen's love for his family and assured him that his letters had been received in ways that transcended physical delivery. I told Eleanor Washington that her husband's final thoughts had been of her, that he died knowing he was loved. I spoke to the miners who died in accidents, the women who died in childbirth, the men who died in gunfights, and the children who died of diseases that modern medicine could have cured. With each successful transition, the building felt lighter, as if centuries of accumulated grief were finally being released. The temporal displacement stopped, the temperature fluctuations ceased, and the whispers that had characterized every night shift since I begun working there faded into peaceful silence. By 4 a.m., the Copper Valley Historical Society felt like a normal building for the first time in my experience. The exhibits were just displays of historical artifacts. The shadows were simply the absence of light, and the only sounds were the natural settling of an old building and the distant traffic on the street outside. But the process had taken its toll on me. Experiencing the deaths and traumas of dozens of spirits had left me emotionally and psychologically exhausted. I felt fragmented, uncertain about which memories were my own and which belonged to the people I'd helped cross over. More concerning, I'd begun to feel a strong pull toward joining them, toward stepping out of my own timeline and into the peaceful silence they'd found. Mrs. Aldridge arrived that morning to find me sitting in the security office, staring at surveillance monitors that showed empty rooms for the first time in decades. The building's supernatural activity had ceased so completely that even the sensitive equipment designed to detect psychic phenomena registered nothing but normal electromagnetic background levels. "You helped them all find peace," she said, studying the readouts with amazement. "In 93 years, this building has never been truly quiet. How do you feel?" I wasn't sure how to answer. Part of me felt profound satisfaction at having helped so many troubled souls find resolution. But another part felt hollow, as if essential pieces of my own identity had been dispersed along with the spirits I'd guided to whatever comes after death. "I think I need to leave," I said finally. "If I stay much longer, I'm going to lose myself completely in their stories." Mrs. Aldridge nodded with understanding. Dr. Whitmore's notes predicted this. He believed that anyone capable of helping spirits cross over would eventually be called to follow them. "The building has served its purpose, Elena. These souls have found peace because you gave them what they needed most, someone who could truly understand their pain and help them let it go." I submitted my resignation that morning, effective immediately. The building no longer needed a night security guard because there was nothing left to guard against. No restless spirits, no temporal anomalies, no supernatural phenomena that required management through carefully developed protocols. But leaving wasn't easy. The Copper Valley Historical Society had become more than just a workplace. It had become a place where I'd connected with human suffering across centuries and helped transform that suffering into peace. The experience had changed me in ways I was still trying to understand, leaving me with memories of lives I'd never lived and traumas I'd never personally experienced but had somehow helped heal. 6 months later, I still drive past the building occasionally, usually in the early morning hours when the light hits the sandstone walls in a way that reminds me of those long nights surrounded by whispers and shadows. The Historical Society remains open to the public, but Mrs. Aldridge tells me the exhibits feel different now, more like genuine historical displays and less like memorials to unresolved pain. They've stopped hiring night security guards. The building doesn't need them anymore. Sometimes, when I'm having trouble sleeping, I think about the spirits I helped cross over and wonder where they went after leaving the Copper Valley Historical Society. I hope they found the peace they'd been seeking for so long, that Martha was reunited with her Benjamin, that Wei Chun delivered his letters to family members who'd been waiting for over a century, that little Maria Santos found the mother figures who'd been watching over lost children since the beginning of time. And sometimes, in those quiet moments just before dawn, I swear I can still hear them, not calling for help anymore, but whispering words of gratitude that drift on the desert wind like prayers being answered after decades of patient waiting. The rules that once governed the night shift at the Copper Valley Historical Society are no longer necessary. The building has returned to being just a repository for artifacts and memories, a place where tourists can learn about Tombstone's complex history without confronting the pain that once lingered in its halls. But I'll never forget what I learned during those 16 weeks, that death doesn't always end suffering, that some stories continue long after their official conclusions, and that sometimes the living can help the dead find a peace that has eluded them for generations. The building taught me that memory isn't just about preserving the past, but about understanding it well enough to let it go. And in helping others find that understanding, I discovered truths about loss, healing, and the strange connections that exist between people across time and space. Connections that persist even after the whispers fade and the silence finally comes.